Good afternoon. We'll try to do this quickly so we can get to afternoon meetings with the Joint Chiefs. But let me start out with giving you guys a quick rundown of the week ahead. On Saturday, tomorrow, the First Family will welcome more than 2,000 local area children from Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia schools and their families for trick-or-treating at the North Portico for Halloween. In addition, the President, First Lady, the Vice President, and Dr. Biden will host a Halloween reception for military families and children of White House and White House residence staff. All sorts of things. I think it's 7 o'clock tomorrow night.
Is the First Family going to dress up?
I have not been told that the First Family is going to dress up. But I will endeavor to check. No, it's not. It's not. I don't know if there's pool or not, to be honest with
They're going to walk up to the front door, ring the bell, and say,
So we are not invited.
you. But you can't. You can't. You're a little old for this, I think. I'm just saying. On Sunday, the President will travel to Camden and Newark, New Jersey, to attend rallies for Governor Corzine. On Monday, the President will attend the second quarterly meeting of the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board here at the White House. On Tuesday morning, the President will meet, as we announced yesterday, with Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, again here at the White House. Later, the President will meet with His Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew here as well. In the afternoon, the President will participate in the U.S.-European Union Summit with Prime Minister of Sweden, Fredrik Reinfeldt, President of the European Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso, and the European Council High Representative Javier Solana. On Wednesday, the President will participate in a credentialing ceremony for foreign ambassadors. Later, he will travel to Madison, Wisconsin to discuss strengthening America's education system. On Thursday, the President will host the White House Tribal Nations Conference. The event will be held at the Department of Interior, and each of the 564 federally recognized tribes has been invited to send a representative. The President will deliver opening and closing remarks at the ceremony. And in the afternoon, the President will meet with President Ian Khama of Botswana here at the White House. The only guidance for Friday is that the President will attend meetings here at the White House. Mr. Feller, take us away.
Sure. Thanks, Robert. A few questions on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Does the White House think it was appropriate for Secretary Clinton to be as blunt as she was towards Pakistan, the comments she made about Pakistan's unwillingness to find terrorists within their borders?
Well, look, we've been in ongoing conversations with the Pakistanis about ways that they can address and go after violent extremists in their country that threaten both Pakistan and the United States. So I think the remarks were completely appropriate.
You think they were completely appropriate? Mm-hmm. There's no chance of that undermining the effort going on here for a new strategy or revamped strategy, Pakistan, Afghanistan. You talk a lot about partnerships, but then you have that kind of sort of calling out of a partner.
Well, look, obviously in those relationships, we expect that both sides, I think both sides would expect the others working constructively to address concerns in that relationship. Obviously, the United States has great concern about extremists in Pakistan, and we will continue to discuss with them what can be done, and those remarks were appropriate.
On the meeting today, which one are we up to now?
7.
That sounds right, 7.
What's the, how would you frame the mission and the expectations for today's meeting from the President's perspective?
Yeah, the President asked to meet with the Joint Chiefs. The second time he's met with them as a group. The first time was, I think, in the first month of the administration. Obviously, these are folks that represent all branches of our armed forces, and I think the President wants an opportunity to talk to them about General McChrystal's assessment. Obviously, they're being in charge of their branch. These are the men who are required to provide trained and equipped soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen for missions both in Afghanistan, Iraq, and throughout the world.
Are they talking about specific troop numbers today, Robert?
Well, look, we're going to go through, we'll go through the region and talk about General McChrystal's assessment. And as we talk about the assessment, I'm sure the resource request will be part of that discussion. Yes, sir.
When the American people hear the White House say that the recovery package has created 650,000 jobs, 1 million jobs, first of all, could you explain the difference between the claim of 650,000 jobs and 1 million jobs? And second of all,
Let me start with that. The
Okay.
640,329 based on the reportable data from projects that have been funded through September 30th by the recovery plan. The data that we received back was to measure direct job impact from that project money, right? So the direct job is in that is again 640,329. The statistics do not measure indirect jobs that may be created through those projects. Let's take an example. If we fund a road project and Jake, you're hired to help lay the pavement on a new widening of an interstate, what's not counted is whether Bill gets his job gets saved at the asphalt plant that that produces the material that ultimately is used in that project. The figures also don't include money that has gone out through tax cuts and other parts of the bill that are not examined in this report.
and the 640,329 directly saved or created, right? Saved or created.
Yep.
How credible should the American people consider these numbers, given that in many cases they're rough estimates and there has been some reporting problems in the past?
Well, there was a reporting problem with one of the contracting numbers because that paperwork went up quite quickly. They've had a chance to go through the numbers over the past couple weeks and address any confusion or errors. This is paperwork directly from a project that money has been appropriated for, so I think the American people can have confidence in them.
And then switching subjects for 1 second, the President signed a Homeland Security Appropriations Bill that contained a provision allowing the Secretary of Defense to block the release not only of these other detainee abuse photographs, but other ones, future ones that may exist. How is that consistent with the promise of transparency? Not so much the decision the President already announced about those specific detainee abuse photographs, but this kind of blanket power that is now vested in the Secretary of Defense.
Well, the blanket power is based on the Secretary of Defense telling the Commander-in-Chief that the release of these photos would threaten the safety and security of American soldiers. I doubt seriously that Secretary Gates, I know that Secretary Gates won't, and I would assume that any future Secretary of Defense is not going to abuse that privilege to say to somebody that the release of this would harm our men and women who are protecting our freedom is not something that you would trigger lightly. And it's narrowly written to assure that our men and women are protected, just as incidents like this are investigated.
I am hard-pressed to imagine any Secretary of Defense approving the release of the Abu Ghraib photographs, because releasing those photographs, any general would argue put American lives at risk, and yet it can also be argued that releasing those photographs stopped a horrific pattern of abuse that was going on at American prisons throughout the world. So if this law had been in effect back then.
Well, first of all, I have not heard Secretary Gates make this argument. I think going backwards into a big hypothetical is is
I'm trying to explain why it is that so many people feel like
No, I
this
understand.
blanket protection, this
But I
blanket
understand, but-
ability to just
but
cover up any crimes.
Let's talk about
that
the
people-
protection going forward rather than generalizing
Okay.
in many ways about
President-
something that you haven't had a discussion with the Secretary of Defense about in the past.
So President Obama has just given Secretary Gates a power that did not exist before to
Yes.
block the release of any prisoner abuse photographs. And
That,
I think there are
that- hold on.
Yeah.
Now let's
Okay.
make this not just block any prisoner photographs. Block prisoner photographs that the Secretary of Defense has deemed threatens the safety of men and women in our uniform. So let's broaden the. Let's make sure we understand what the definition is. This is a trigger that the Secretary of Defense has to determine, and that before it can be triggered.
Let me put it this way. Let me ask it this way. Does President Obama think the release of the Abu Ghraib photographs put American lives at risk?
Well, again, you're going back into a generalization and hypotheticals.
This is what the president just gave his Secretary of Defense the power to do.
I have not talked to him about those specific photos, nor have I talked to Secretary Gates about those
Do
specific
you
photos.
think it's an unrealistic
And,
fear that people might have that if a similar circumstance were to present itself, the judgment might come down
Well-
against releasing, which in the eyes of many people had a remedial effect on that very problem?
This administration takes seriously. I think based on what we have released publicly, detainee abuse and the conditions with which detainees are held, right? We've taken a lot of grief for that. But what the president determined is that we are not going to put through that our men and women in harm if the Secretary of Defense determines that something like that could do that. Just as the regional commanders communicated to the Secretary of Defense that what these type of photos could do. But Major, I'm happy to talk to the Secretary of Defense about this, but I would not want to generalize going back by using the word could so many times. Yes, sir.
Are you, do you think that the stimulus is doing what you expected it to do up to this point, or did you expect more jobs to be saved or created?
No, I think we're on track with what we estimated would likely happen. I think yesterday's figures denote that we have seen a growth in our economy, particularly if you look at, we haven't had a growth like we had in the previous quarter in more than 2 years. We haven't had any positive economic growth in more than a year. So I think for those that have said the stimulus or the recovery plan aren't working, you're hard pressed to back that statement up with the figures that have come out in the last couple of days.
But in terms of the number of jobs, the 640,000 say were created.
Direct jobs for the 47% that was required to be examined by the independent board through this date.
So
Right.
is that where the administration saw it at this point? I mean, when you're sort of looking.
That's approximately, the million jobs saved or created has us on track to where we thought we'd be.
And then back to the meeting again today. So, one of the questions that's being looked at is, with these military leaders, do you have the personnel to potentially match 40,000 going into
Well,
Afghanistan?
I think that force strength, the health of the force, is certainly a topic that will come up. Their views on the assessment will come up. What I mentioned, which is I think also what your network is reporting, that's statutorily what the Joint Chiefs have purview.
Are you maintaining that the figure of 1 million, more or less, jobs is reached by counting the indirect jobs?
Well,
that flow off the 600 and some
I
odd
think
thousand?
through a combination of the indirect jobs as well as the percentage of the act that has not yet, that is not measured through this report, yes.
Your own material yesterday suggested that it was the percentage not yet measured, the half of the money not yet spent, or at least not recorded.
Well, again, there's about 47% of the total number is examined by law in this report. This report, again, required by the statute, measures direct jobs from projects. It does not count money that goes from tax cuts, money that would go from others or go to recipients through other safety net programs.
You're making these jobs that you say have been counted so carefully sound like a scientific, actual, a number that can be observed scientifically.
At 3 o'clock, you'll be able to observe it holistically on your computer.
You can, each one of these so-called saved or created jobs represents a concrete new job or saved job?
Yes,
Or 2 part-time jobs, right?
yes,
Yeah, or 2 part-time jobs?
yes.
Your critics don't believe that it's possible to count anything like that.
Our critics didn't think the recovery plan would help the economy grow, but I think the critics, if you put 50 cents in the newspaper machine and pull the arm, you'll see that our critics haven't been so right.
75 cents.
75 cents. Yeah, well,
Where are you buying
okay.
$2
See,
for the time?
don't worry, there's a payment that goes along with that for
Just
the
keep buying.
recovery plan to
Look it up
to get the
online.
time. Jeff has had nothing to say during this interplay, so we'll, I'm sorry, Helen, go ahead. Do what?
And many others.
Yes, ma'am.
A fellow Nobel Putin, who's a columnist in the New York Times,
Mhm.
he said
A
the
fellow Nobel,
conservatives don't want Americans to have universal health care, and they don't want the president to succeed. Does the president agree with that?
Well, look, Helen, the president has said on a number of occasions that he does think some of his critics in Congress on health care have decided that they want to play a political game rather than one that addresses the problem that we've dealt with for decades, and that is health insurance reform. Absolutely.
Why doesn't he go after them then and call them what they are?
Well, I think the president has done quite a bit of that. That's been happening throughout this process.
A
Chuck?
few things. One, is it fair to say the strategic review in Afghanistan is winding down?
I think it is nearing its. I think it's nearing its conclusion. Yes,
Okay.
I've seen. I've gotten.
Everybody's got to wait.
Well, no,
carefully.
I've gotten a couple questions today about whether the people have stated that this is the last meeting.
It's not the last meeting. Is
I
that
have,
correct?
I have certainly not been told that it's the last meeting.
But there's no other meeting scheduled?
Not currently.
Is there likely to be one next week?
There could be, yes.
On Iran, it seems as if there are reports that the deal that the negotiators agreed to, as far as on nuclear fuel, has been nixed by the government itself. How concerned are you that the Iranian government is not negotiating in good faith?
Well, we have yet to see, and we await the details of their response to the IAEA. We've seen the same reports you have, but we have yet to see
When
a
are you
detailed
expecting this
response.
detailed response?
We're in constant contact with the IAEA in order to get that.
Is there a debt? I mean, is the president going to say, you know what, if we don't get it here, then you know,
Well-
we're going to think about the next step
well,
here. We're going to think about sanctions. Or we're
Well,
going to think about
I would
something.
simply say that the president's time is not unlimited. This was not about talking for the sake of talking. This was about reaching an agreement that just a few weeks ago seemed to be something that the Iranians wanted.
On H1N1, is there anything that you guys, looking back, could have done differently to have sped up this vaccine? Have you guys?
Well, let me say, I think we have the numbers that I got earlier today. I think there are now 26.2, I believe, million doses that have been made available.
Over 100 million. at this
Right.
point.
Well, we have obviously had problems in the delivery of the vaccine from manufacturers. The 26.2 million, though, is 3 million more than we had just 2 days ago. Look, I think it's accurate to say the president has been and is frustrated with ensuring that this vaccine is delivered on time and won't be satisfied until those that want to be vaccinated from H1N1 have the opportunity through the vaccine to do so.
Anything the government could have done differently?
Well, again, I think we have the manufacturing of the vaccine, which normally takes about 6 to 9 months, in this case, has taken closer to 6 months, but it hasn't been as fast as we were told or as fast as we had hoped. But we'll continue. I know that John Brennan and others meet daily on this topic to ensure that we have the vaccine that we need as quickly as possible.
The state believing believing the private sector in this?
Well, I think we certainly had hoped that their predictions on this would be correct. Yes, sir.
Two quick questions. Is General Jones's trip to Russia, to Moscow, a sign that the negotiations on the START follow-on treaty are on schedule, or that they are at some kind of impasse?
No, General Jones is back from that trip today and will participate in the meeting this afternoon in the Situation Room. We think the talks are progressing as we had hoped for a treaty that expires the 5th of December.
So you think you'll make that?
We believe so, yes.
Okay. And anything more on the meeting of the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board meeting?
I don't have a topic, but we can see if there is a little bit more detail going forward. Yes, sir.
Robert, do you have an estimate of what the cost per job of those 640,000 would be?
I don't, and I think the economists would tell you, Mark, that there's still investment in those jobs that is being made, the projects. I think on the form there's a part that denotes that there's still a certain amount of investment in this project that's yet to be spent out. So I'm not sure you can make a one-to-one math conclusion on that.
Do you know if the president has begun reading or intends to read the House health care bill?
I don't know the answer to that, but I can ask.
Is anyone in the White House reading it?
I can
All
assure you,
2,000 pages of it?
all 1,909, I can assure you there are many people that are studying it, yes.
You've said that the president's decision on Afghanistan would be weeks away. Is that still correct? Are you still sticking with that? Does that mean that he will not be deciding it before he leaves for Asia on November 11th?
I haven't got any greater guidance than weeks, so I'll stick with that.
Before, during, or after that?
I can narrow it down to either before, during, or after.
It's really coming after the election, though, right?
It certainly
have a
could
meeting
come
next
earlier,
week.
but I don't anticipate that it would.
The New Jersey election or the Afghan?
I assumed Afghan, but a fairly good
For the
question.
record, I was asking about the Afghan.
Okay, all right.
Let me follow up
Fair
quick
enough. Let the
on
record
Chuck's
reflect.
question on H1N1. With whom and or what is the president frustrated with about the vaccine?
Well, I think the president is frustrated that that all those who want to be vaccinated thus far haven't had an opportunity to do so. We'd hope that the vaccine would, as we had been told, be here faster. It has not, but the president believes that, and the team believe they're making progress. I noted that there's 3 million additional doses of the vaccine than there were just 2 days ago. And we're working with state and local authorities to ensure that there are all that can be done is being done to ensure the speedy delivery of that vaccine.
Is it a bureaucratic breakdown or a vaccine production breakdown?
Well, I think right now we'd hoped that what the manufacturer had said in terms of getting the vaccine here earlier would have been true.
To follow up on the election question,
The New Jersey one or the
New Jersey one. It's been reported that the president's pollster, Joel Benison, is taking an active role in Governor Corzine's campaign.
I think he works for him.
Yes. Does that in any way elevate the stakes for the White House in that election or in Tuesday's results generally? Do you see anything coming out of results Tuesday that could assist or in any way undermine what the White House is trying to accomplish legislatively on Capitol Hill?
Based on Joel's participation in New Jersey?
Based on whatever election result, if there is some speculation if Corzine doesn't win, things don't work out for Craig Deeds, Bill Owens doesn't win in New York 23, it could put a damper on things for the White House in a political environment where people are suddenly nervous about maybe short-term political prospects as opposed to larger legislative aims the White House is putting.
Yeah, look, I think we continue to take the long view on what's going on in Washington and throughout the country. We'll have time to dissect whatever those results are on Tuesday, but I don't I don't think it portends, quite honestly, whatever the results are, I don't think they portend a lot in dealing with the future. I saw that somebody, I think somebody had mentioned that you know, if you lost either governorship, it would impact. I mean, in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, in Virginia, New Jersey, Democrat won in either one of those. I don't think anybody thought that when they looked at the election results in 2002, they thought that President Bush was significantly hampered by that.
The couple of Recovery Act questions. If you look at the 643,000 jobs, you say
640,329.
directly
Right.
created.
Yeah.
Roughly, that's at a pace of about 80,000 per month. If you were just to go out, since the act was signed on February 17th, not counting February, but counting the months since, that'd be a fair.
Well, I trust your math,
Okay,
but
yeah.
other than that, I can't speak to it.
And yet, on a monthly basis, about 500,000 or more Americans are filing first-time unemployment
Right.
benefit claims.
I would say this: we're happy it's not 580,000. Right.
You'll take what you've
Well,
created.
the president obviously not satisfied that anybody that wants to find a job in this country can't, and there are a lot of people that that applies to, unfortunately. But I think we saw through GDP growth a positive improvement that we think is the beginning of better things. But I don't think there's any doubt that if you can look at this plan and say, without it, we would have lost, you would have had 80,000 additional people every month applying for unemployment benefits. Yeah, not only are you not paying out those unemployment benefits, but that person has a job. So I think that's actually a good way of discussing the multiplier effect indirectly of jobs saved or created.
Last one on stimulus, and I'll let go, I promise.
Jeff
Vice
is
President
waiting
Biden just said a
patiently.
moment ago that all of the GDP growth, or virtually all of it, can be attributed to Recovery Act spending.
I think a lot of it, yes.
When we were discussing with you the Edmunds.com situation yesterday, you pointed to 1.66% of that 3.5% GDP growth as attributable to car sales.
Yes.
Cash for clunkers. Now, Jared has told me that your analysis for the stimulus and its economic benefits doesn't count cash for clunkers spending. It only counts Recovery Act spending.
I'm sorry, the analysis for today? Yeah, because as Jared will tell you, as I would too, that Cash for Clunkers was funded out of a separately, right.
So my question is, how do we reconcile these two? If Cash for Clunkers was 1.66 of the 3.5, and all the Recovery Act spending is responsible for the 3.5 GDP growth, I don't see how those two things can both be true.
Well,
If the Recovery Act was responsible for all of the
here's what-
3.5% GDP growth.
let me go back to what you
but
said a
Cash for
minute ago.
Clunkers was
Let me go back to what you said a
responsible
minute
for half
ago.
of that.
If we didn't have the GDP, if we didn't have the Recovery Act, our GDP would probably be, somewhere near flat, right?
That's what you said. Okay.
Right. I think that's how I'd measure it. Without it, we would be basically middling along. We, through the Recovery Act, have seen positive economic growth, and that's a good thing.
I know, but yesterday you said in defense of Cash for Clunkers, almost half of the 3.5% GDP growth was attributable to Cash for Clunkers.
I didn't say that. That's just the figures based on the GDP itself. Yes.
But that's not Recovery Act spending.
No, it's not Recovery Act. It's part of the plan that the president has put forward in order to help the economy grow.
But if half the GDP number this is Cash for Clunkers, how can it be? I'm still trying to figure out how the Recovery Act can be responsible for all the 3.5% GDP
I'll
number.
go back and look at the math figures on this. I think what's undeniable, Major, is that the recovery plan is helping the economy grow, right?
I'm just asking. Then.
Well, so am I.
Okay.
What'd you come to the conclusion?
It may be 3.5. It may be the
But
difference between 3.5
is
and
the economy growing for the
1.66,
first
which you
time
said
in,
was
is the
attributable to
economy
Cash
growing for the
Clunkers?
first time in a year, based on your assessment of the figures?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Can we get a blackboard in here?
I have to get some math teachers as well. Yes, sir.
Some coffee?
Thanks,
Thanks. That was anything but boring.
All right, settle down.
What exactly has the president
taken away from all these meetings that he's had, this is the 7th one he's had today. If you could shed some light on what he's, how he's processing this, how he's keeping this, right? What does he talk with his other advisors about after he comes out of these meetings? And ultimately, have you decided, and how will you have him explain this to the American people?
Yeah, let me take the second one. We have not, in all honesty, had extensive conversations about that yet. I do believe, without getting into specifics, I think the president strongly believes that it's important for the American people and for the international community to know his reasoning behind whatever decision he makes, and to clearly explain our goals and objectives in Afghanistan and Pakistan and the region as a whole. So I anticipate that whatever form it ultimately takes, the president will use the occasion to explain some of that to the American people so that they understand his decision-making and his thought process. In terms,
TV address or something for the nation?
again, we haven't gotten into broad specifics on that yet. So, on the first part, Jeff, look, I think, I used to have it calculated. I should just go back and do it. The number of hours that he has spent in these meetings is probably now, at the end of today will probably be getting close to 20 direct hours of his time. The group, the principals that meet with the president additionally take time to get the material ready and are prepared to answer questions for the president, probably at least twice as much of the president's time the principals have spent. So obviously the president and his team have spent a pretty big chunk of time evaluating very, very closely each of these individual countries, their relationship together and their impact on the region. At the conclusion of these meetings, he generally is off to the next thing. I think he has spent quite a bit of time after the meetings back in the office, back in his office, probably primarily in the residence at night, going back and reading through his notes as well as notes that he's taken on the meetings, and oftentimes will come out with questions that the team will prepare the answers for the next meeting.
Is it possible, how have these 7 meetings not created the need for an 8th and a 9th and a 10th? At what point does he stop these meetings, announce a decision, and fine-tune after that?
Right. Look, the president has certainly told all of us that that we were going to go through an extensive and exhaustive review. But, Jeff, I can assure you that he knows and the team know that you cannot and we will not meet in perpetuity on this. But the president believes that we're still assessing the information that he needs to make that final decision.
Yes. Just briefly to follow on that, there was a report that he'd asked for a province-by-province breakdown of the Afghan leadership. Are there other outstanding things like that he still wants to come back to him before he can make a decision?
I don't know what that list would be. That certainly, as was talked about in the Post, was something that the president had asked be created because, in all honesty, less because it had anything to do with resource requests for those individual provinces, but as we wind down our commitment ultimately in Afghanistan, we're going to have to transfer the security, the economic development, the civilian nature, the governmental function both in Kabul and throughout the country to entities in Kabul and in these provinces. And the president wants, as we're beginning, or as we're going through this assessment, to begin to think about what structures are in place and what structures have to be strengthened in order to eventually transfer that core responsibility to cobble in provincial government.
Understanding that, just, are there any
Yeah.
other things that he's asked for?
Nothing
need to come back?
nothing that come to mind right away, but maybe there may be some stuff today, I don't know. Ann?
Early yesterday morning, when he was at Dover and met with the families said that he asked, is there anything we can do for the families? And the mother of Donna Griffin, the mother of the last of the dignified transfers, said that she told the president, don't leave our troops hanging. When he walks into the Situation Room right about now, does he have any sense that the time he's taking to make these decisions is leaving those troops hanging?
Again, to go back through what's happened, the president believed that additional forces were needed in March, and he added them to get us to a point where we could evaluate the outcome of the election. That obviously has been delayed a little bit, but he believes this is a point in which it's necessary to fully assess where we are. I don't believe the president thinks, I know he doesn't believe that this assessment is in any way doing that. I think he understands, and I think, as you heard him say yesterday in the Oval Office, I think his commitment, particularly after going to a place like Dover, is to understand the full cost of the war.
What did he think how did he respond when she said, don't?
I have not talked to him about the individual comments that, just conversations that he had with the families. Thanks, guys. I'll go to this meeting.
Is the president rooting for the Phillies or the Yankees?
I don't know the answer to that. Probably, I will say, I think the Phillies because of Pluff, but I don't know the answer.
Watching a lot